Hello and welcome to an introduction to polarity thinking. This is actually a seminar that my wife, Dr. Luann Shaw, and I are presenting at an International Research Congress in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So I wanted to share some thoughts and ideas with you from that team. It's designed mostly for medical and health professionals, but there's some applications that obviously have some practicality and use for us here in organizational behavior, organizational leadership, and certainly in regard to conflict management. So when we look at polarities, it really comes down to unsolvable problems, those problems that don't have a clear answer, that give us a sense that we just need to do this and then everything will be well. So some of the tensions, when we look at healthcare, that's an example that you can kind of pull out and say, all right, well, why don't we just solve these things? You know, the World Health Organization has identified 10 threats that really are a problem for people, especially in developing nations, like air pollution, climate change, communicable diseases, influenza pandemics, HIV/AIDS, dengue fever, malaria, Ebola, those types of things. Why can't we just solve it? But obviously there's more to it than that. Lack of preparedness. So even though sometimes we know the best thing that could help us be healthier, why don't we do it? I would say the same thing in many churches. We know what it takes to live in harmony with other fellow believers. We could just apply Matthew 18 and, approach people with grace and truth, and yet we still have church conflicts, and we have church splits and areas where there's interpersonal conflict. We know that communication is important, and treating each other with forgiveness is important, and yet marriages still fall apart, and relationships are severed and broken. So it's not lack of knowledge sometimes, or lack of preparedness, but it's really a disconnect sometimes between what we know and how we actually behave. Policy, delivery systems, roles and entry-level scope of practice, that's more medical-based, but culture and quality are issues that definitely have a polarity application. So some of the common themes when we think about polarities is that it's really complex. Polarities are essentially interdependent opposites, that there's not necessarily one simple answer. There's always significant impact, and as we deal with people who are complex and diverse and bring their own history and perspective to any situation, there's always multiple points of view. So one of the examples that's used often in polarity management really comes from Gestalt psychology. So this was developed by Fritz Perls, and in particular this illustration, depending on what you see, this was developed by in a German humor magazine, Die Fliegenden Blätter, in 1892. So it's a fairly old drawing, but some people right away see a rabbit, and other people see a duck. And some people are able to immediately see both. So partly the perspective comes down to, what do I see here? Do I see a rabbit? So if you see a rabbit, you see his eye, and he's facing to the right, his mouth and his ears are flying back. Or if you see a duck, then those are not ears, that's a bill. Be a little bit closer. So are those ears or a bill? It's hard to say. So more recent thinking looks at and. So instead of I could do this or that, polarity thinking really embraces the and. So should we do this or that? We should do this and that. When we look at paradox, dilemmas, tensions in the literature, all these things reflect polarities. A lot of times competitive edge is seen in polarity thinking. So if I can manage polarities well, do whatever it is, whether it's a competitive advantage in business or a strategic advantage in my nonprofit organization, or if it's just ministry effectiveness, how can we do well serving one another when we realize that we need both sides of this paradox? There's an interconnectedness. We know that effective leaders also, who have an ability to approach polarities in a constructive, positive way, are able to help move through conflicts and help get them unstuck. So polarities, there's a lot of research on it. This work was done primarily through the work of Dr. Barry Johnson, who wrote his book in 1996 on polarity management, and it's been pretty much a classic in the field up until that time. When we think about problem solving itself, what we can say is a situation, person, or thing that needs attention. And it needs to be dealt with or solved. So when we let conflicts simmer, we find that it just gets worse. Most conflicts are not just going to get better on their own. Some do, but most of the time that's not going to be the reality. So it needs to be dealt with or solved. A question in mathematics needs an answer as well, and that's from the Cambridge Dictionary. For our purposes here, certainly from an organizational behavior standpoint, there are things that need attention. When we've worked through Kotter's book, the 8 stages of leading change, there's something has to change. That first step is a sense of urgency. If we don't do something, there's going to be a problem. So for us to move from point A to point B, we have to feel that sense of urgency. We have to deal with something, approach a problem with solutions. So again, another Gestalt visual here for us to look at. So what is a polarity? Interdependent values or points of view. So some people see 2 people looking at one another, other people see a chalice, and some people see both. One is not more valuable or more correct or more important. They're just different. So we realize that we need both of those to create the other. The off space is really where the defining boundaries are found. So problems are polarities. Problems to solve, they're not ongoing. There is an endpoint. So especially for our work in Christian ministry, problem solving is very effective in dealing with sin issues. So if there's a sin issue in our congregation, we approach it, we address it. We might apply Matthew 18, approach it with the individual first. If that doesn't work, maybe take 1 or 2 godly individuals to go with and approach them together. If that doesn't work, maybe open it up a little bit more, and eventually, if that is not addressing the sin issue, then we have to bring it before the congregation, and that's a biblical perspective on addressing a conflict. It has an endpoint. There's a solution. Problems are solvable. There's independent alternatives, so we could do this or this. And it also has mutually exclusive opposites, like yes, no, or now, later, or here, there. Polarities, in contrast, are really only managed. There's no solution, there's no endpoint. They're not solvable problems, and we get into trouble when we try and solve polarities because they're not solvable problems. They contain mutually exclusive opposites. So like individual or team. Should I support my individual on my team who needs special attention, needs support, maybe addressing the emotional concerns of being maybe going on at work or at home? Or do I support my team? Do I support my organization from more of a macro perspective? And the answer is yes. Well, of course I do. I have to care about individuals. I also have to care about the collective body. Compete and collaborate. Those are polarities. At times it might be healthy competition that helps motivate and stimulate. At times maybe we have to do group work and work as teams. So teamwork is not a solution. It's a method. Work life, home life, both of those are important as well. And if we get those 2 out of kilter, we're going to suffer in both places. So, here's some examples that we could apply to a healthcare setting. Should we implement a clean water initiative? Well, yeah. How should we address the pollution issues? There might be multiple perspectives. Should we focus on patients or staff to improve satisfaction? Well, obviously, there's a lot of customer focus in service industries. We could say the same thing in ministry. Should we focus on congregants, or should I support my ministry team? That would be more a polarity, where the other ones approach more of a problem-solving perspective. And asking the question, what issues are you facing? We don't know enough yet. That could be a problem-solving perspective that might have answers. It might be creative, trying to generate ideas, or it could be a polarity. We don't know. So as we move into polarity mapping itself, looking at the tool of how can we apply this to maybe leadership or even educational teams, or I would say ministry teams, let's look at what this might look at. So one of the things that polarity management theorists, such as Dr. Barry Johnson, might ask is, what are the issues that keep you up at night? So when you think about your own context, your organization, your employer, your ministry, your institution, what are the issues that keep you up at night? These might very well be polarities, because there may not be a simple solution. Or the solutions that we tried just haven't worked. Maybe it worked for a time, but then it seemed to fail. It seemed to just not work well. And there's a good reason for that if it's a polarity that we're trying to solve. How do people typically approach these issues? So gaining some perspective on what's been tried and worked for a time but then no longer worked. And why do so many change initiatives fail or issues reoccur? And that's a good question to ask because it gives perspective on what is the emotional bearing or the grit of our team as we're trying to think through problem solving. Maybe we've been trying to solve polarities and now people are frustrated. They're getting burned out. They're feeling like there's just not leadership support or administrative support for these ongoing issues that just never seem to get solved. So looking at them from a polarity perspective can help to motivate people, motivate congregants, motivate volunteers and those who are in our organizations and agencies to think through, why is it reoccurring? Because maybe we're trying to solve something that's unsolvable. We're wasting our time and spinning our wheels. So some of the common polarities in leadership, for example, should I be directive and tell my people what to do, or should I be participative and encourage their participation? And obviously that's a bad question. The answer is yes, you should do both. So I should be directive, where I'm clear in what I expect of people, what I'm hoping for, what I would love for them to accomplish, and also participative. So getting greater insight into here's what I'm looking for, but how you do that, that's where your creativity and the gifts that God has given you come alive, right? Not dictating everything, but looking more at the results. Should I be visionary? Of course. And also being a realist. That's a polarity. So it's important to keep the big thing in mind, creating vision. We've, had quite a bit of material on the importance of vision and, promoting that vision in a leadership context. At the same time, I can't be pie in the sky. We have to be real and say, how can we organize this in bite-sized chunks so that we're still making progress, but we can also track and measure that progress in a way that works. So teamwork and individual work. So again, those are methods. Those are not an answer. They're poles. Task focus and relationship focus. Yes, they're both important. And of course, stability and change is probably one of the biggest ones we see in nonprofit settings, in ministries, where we have the importance of stability and tradition and those things that unite us. Perhaps it's our theological perspective, which we believe is a valid approach. It's a positive approach. It's a godly approach. And yet, sometimes when we're experiencing change, we might feel threatened. And yet, if we're not willing to innovate, if we're not willing to address people and approach them where they are, we know that obviously culture and society is changing rapidly, and we have to innovate so that we both have stability and tradition at the same time we're embracing change and moving into the future in a positive way. In education, educator satisfaction, student satisfaction, traditional methods versus innovative methods, the role of technology. Should we have pedagogy or andragogy? And of course the answer is yes, theory and knowing or reality and doing. Both sides of poles that are important. Competition, collaboration, and profession-centric and interprofessional-centric. So to what degree do I bring in others who have a diverse perspective and that it actually helps me in my field as I get alternate viewpoints? This is a polarity map, again developed by Dr. Barry Johnson and Polarity Management Associates, his company. So when we look at a polarity map and think through what's a good way to visualize some of these polarities, there's both a positive and a negative side. So on the positive side, there's a greater purpose statement. So why is it important to balance this polarity? If I could use the example of stability and change, or we could say tradition and innovation, why balance it? Because we want to be true to who we are. It's our mission. It's our vision of wanting to reach people as we promote our mission. That's an important reason to balance the polarity. And then that balances out our deeper fears from a lack of balance. So perhaps, maybe I'm afraid of change, therefore I retreat and I cling to my tradition, but at the expense of becoming irrelevant. All of a sudden, we're not growing, we're dying, we're losing people, and nobody wants to be part of our group anymore. And that's a deeper fear. And yet I can cling to the fact that, well, my perspective is right, but all of a sudden I find that I'm speaking really just to myself because everyone else is left. So if we're really going to balance polarities well, we're going to tap into both of those. Then there's action steps and early warnings on each side of those poles. So to give an example, we could say here's a greater purpose statement, neutral values, The infinity loop represents that this is a dynamic process. There's the virtuous cycle, so if I can keep most of the values on the positive side, then I can avoid the vicious cycle, which taps into our greater fears. And we know that when we're in organizational behavior, fear is not the best motivator, especially for us who are leaders, and we're all leaders here. When we think about motivating by fear, we're probably not going to get the best results that we would hope for. If we can tap into the greater purpose of why we're all here, why we're pulling together, our mission, our vision, that we can align that with the greater purpose of what we're here to do, we're going to be more in the virtuous cycle of managing those things. So, of course, the positive and negative results of both poles, and the specific steps on what that would look like for us to have that. So one of the metaphors that Dr. Johnson uses in polarity mapping is the concept of breathing. So of course we might say from a problem-solving perspective, I need oxygen. And if I approach that as, well, the solution to needing oxygen is inhaling, that's a good solution, although it's going to be short-lived, literally, because all of a sudden now we have increased carbon dioxide that comes from breathing the oxygen, and now I have a new problem. I have carbon dioxide buildup, I need oxygen. So I need to exhale. And we have this management of poles that we're breathing, we're inhaling, we're exhaling, and that's much like these unsolvable problems or these interdependent opposites. To give an example of a thriving workplace and a dysfunctional workplace, some of the things we could say is, we'll start here. Say, in my relationship tasks, what's a thriving workplace? It's a place where people care about each other. People help each other get the job well done. We trust each other to work through conflicts that arise. That's the place I want to work, right? Relationships are important. We care for one another. We're doing God's work in a way that we feel like we have cohesion, collaboration, and fellowship. At the same time, tasks get done. So I also want to work in a place that accomplishes their mission. I don't want to work in a place that we feel like, we don't really do a good job. We don't serve our congregants, our customers, our consumers, our participants, our students well. So people also focus on the work at hand. Things get done. People get their own job done well. I like to say that, I serve among a team of rock stars, that people really do an amazing job, because there's also the task focus, that people are good at what they do. They're experts. And we're also good at identifying conflicts that arise. However, when we spend too much time on that, things can start to fall into the negative pole of the task list. So I'm moving from positive to negative. Sometimes if I get too task focused, then people pay little attention to each other, right? Because I'm so focused on, well, this has to get done. There's this important task. We're down to a deadline. People are left to get their work done on their own without support from others. So it can feel isolating. People steer clear of working through difficult issues. Maybe I feel because I'm isolated, I just don't want to bother my coworkers, or I don't want to appear incompetent, so I'm not going to ask for help. So then, as I move back into wanting to have a healthy relationship, I move up to the upper right quadrant. But if I don't do that, all of a sudden I'm feeling isolated, I'm focusing on my tasks, but then relationships suffer in a dysfunctional workplace. And maybe how we treat people gets in the way of getting work done. So now if I'm on a team project, nobody wants to work on a team because I'm so focused on my work that they're just not interested. They're like, man, I don't want him on my team. He's just not a good person to work with. People do a poor job of getting their own work done well. So not only am I not doing my own work, I don't want to be on a team, things are starting to slide. Maybe my attitude slides and I start not really caring anymore. Also, we avoid identifying difficult issues. So maybe because I don't have that relationship equity, I don't talk to my coworkers when things arise. So it gives us an example on, how can we support one another both in the polarity of managing relationships and managing tasks. So in a healthy system, we're going to move through that and try and keep most of our energy, most of our attention on the upper quadrants of both the task and the relationship quadrants, because those things are important. And again, that would be a healthy system that stays mostly in the upper quadrants. An unhealthy or a dysfunctional workplace environment really is tapping into the emotion of fear, and they're going to have most of the negatives in both of the quadrants. So it provides a helpful example of how we do that. We could say another example could be, I want to run a marathon, right? I can run a marathon, so how do I do that? I have to both build muscle and I have to increase endurance. But obviously if I train too hard, I'm working on my endurance, I might injure myself. So as you run, you've got to do it in baby steps, like What About Bob? And if I train too hard, you're going to be hurt. At the same time, if I'm not working out enough in building the muscles, you're going to have atrophy. So it's this constant managing of polarities. One of the models that they use is keep it small. All right, so if I want to have big results, I have to think small. So it stands for seeing, mapping, assessing, learning, and leveraging. So hopefully we're always learning. I've been personally influenced a lot through Dr. Carol Dweck out of Stanford University and her growth mindset versus having a fixed mindset. You know, even if someone says to me, I can't do that, one of the suggestions she would have is you can't do that yet. So maybe I can't do this yet, but I will. I'll learn how to do it. I'll find a way to do it. Perhaps I'll gain some new skills or insights or abilities or resources or other people that can help me over the hump, and together we'll do it. So even though if you can't do something now with a growth mindset, eventually you will be able to do it. So learning is so important, and leveraging as well in the small 5-step process. And we think about, again, kind of hitting one of those areas where injury throws us into a tailspin, or what that looks like if we polarity map, again, the marathon example. Running on most days, feeling tired when you wake up in the morning, that means I probably need to rest more. Getting adequate downtime between workouts, and, you know, trying not to miss a workout day or 2 or 5, or I'm going to have muscle atrophy and I'm not going to achieve my goal. So when we think about it in practice, what applications can we have? So where is it used? Polarity management has been used in education. It's been used in law enforcement when we think about some of the social conflicts taking place right now. Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Police Lives Matter. You know, clearly there's a narrative that has validity that we need to be concerned about and should think about and should honor. Healthcare, right? If I say, well, healthcare is important, but what about the cost? Who should have access to healthcare? Should we reduce costs? There's a lot to stand there. Religious congregations, one that we mentioned earlier, is stability or tradition and change or innovation. That's a polarity. Leadership, right? Leadership itself is an area that is tapping into polarity management. Organizations are using polarity thinking. Schools and communities as well, and community developers. So why is it needed? To help get unstuck. To manage change. And Barry says if you want to guarantee the failure of a change effort, tie it to one pole of a polarity. If you want success, tie it to both poles. So if I say, you know, my church is, and I've seen this in unfortunately too many instances, had a church that I used to attend and they wanted to be a seeker service, right? We're losing members. Many of our older seasoned saints are passing away. We need to be relevant for the young crowd. So they got rid of the old music. They got rid of the old pews and put in chairs and carpet and lights and a rock band, and we're going to get rid of the old preaching and we're going to do more seeker service messages, and we're not even going to do a regular offering because that's offensive to new people. We'll just leave a bucket in the back, and if people want to give, they give, and we just want to be all things to all people, and kind of scrapped the tradition and went with innovation and what they thought was going to pull people in. And for a short time, it actually did. They grew in getting new members. However, they lost a lot of their faithful few who had been there all along and felt like things were selling out. And eventually the church did have to bring in a new pastor and consultants, and they were really just a fraction of what they had been, because they saw innovation as the solution, but they really lost their roots. And we see the same thing happen when churches or congregations or organizations get stuck in doing things the way that we've always done it, right? As society and things change, I cling even tighter to my tradition because that's what I know. And I'm afraid of change, I'm afraid of innovation, and we suffer for it. So polarity thinking, it helps us to promote our mission, our vision, and our values, to say these are important, different perspectives, the both and thinking that's going to help propel us forward in serving others well. And also motivating team members. It acknowledges that there's a sense and an importance to stability, and at the same time that change is inevitable, and we want to be on the front end of it, that we want to manage change well. So, polarity thinking is identifying the polarity. Seeing is relieving. So seeing it actually sometimes on a polarity map, saying, yes, that's exactly the conflict that we're having, or that's the perspective that maybe I'm not seeing. It's acknowledging bias and embracing your opposite. So maybe for me, I see change as a solution. I'm ready to innovate. The writing is on the wall, and yet it's important for me to remember that the person that I'm in conflict with, who is really clinging to tradition, that's important because there's stability in that. And I probably need to spend more time affirming and honoring that tradition is important. And they need to do likewise in seeing that tradition's important, and yet we have to innovate if we're going to survive. There's wisdom in resistance. There's a phrase in judo and martial arts about never strong-arm the resistance. Instead, you go with it. So instead of being defensive, or tapping into my Freudian defense mechanisms and getting upset when there's conflict, rather say, what can I learn from this? If there's a conflict, there's something here that I need to learn about. I need to grow from it. And also, informed decisions, go slow to go fast, and that kind of taps back into that 5-step process of moving through and learning and growing throughout the process. Culture of healthy teams, shared purpose, dialogue, relationships, scope of practice and service, and again, that comes back to our mission. What are we really about? Who are we missionally? That is our key person that we're serving, or our key demographic that we're serving. Competency and integrated competencies, realizing that there's strengths in my team, and sometimes the best person I need on the team is someone who is not like me at all. They bring a diversity and a perspective that is absolutely unlike me, and it's being open to different perspectives and recognizing my own blind spots and growing from that. That's a healthy team. Infrastructure, networking. It might be people within our organizations and congregations and businesses and churches, or it might be people from outside the community that can help us, along with tools and resources. All those things are elements of healthy teams. When we think about implications in academia, certainly at Grace Christian University, our perspective on academics. Do we have traditional brick and mortar classes with an on-site professor, or do we go more to a andragogy online format? And the answer is yes, of course. There's a lot of changes taking place in higher education. There's cost considerations and outcomes considerations that education is wrestling with, these types of polarities. Research framework, asking which kinds of questions do we do, quantitative or qualitative or mixed method studies, or how do we answer these types of questions? Is it single researcher, or should we do team research models where we bring in multiple sites and make it much bigger and broader and publish our results? And yes, all of the above. Leadership functions and teamwork, which we covered a little bit earlier. Practice issues, honoring and respecting diversity. And as we move into our material on cultural intelligence, there's clearly implications that have polarities attached. Collaborations, and even when we think about policies, managing those polarities well, that make room for growth and make room for ambiguity, are going to help us in writing good policy and having good practices. So hopefully that gives you a little perspective on polarity management as a perspective, and I hope you found this useful and helpful. It's been a pleasure and an honor to share some thoughts with you on polarities and polarity thinking. At least as one more tool in your helper toolbox as you think about addressing those concerns, those problems that don't have an immediate solution attached. So, thank you.